Welcome back. Today I will talk about the effect of government actions in the market and how those interventions affect the market equilibrium outcomes from the perspective of efficiency. So, we are going to mainly be looking at four different kinds of government interventions. The first two are probably the most common form of government intervention in any market where the government imposes tax on the market. Now, we will try to distinguish between two kinds of tax that government imposes in a market and thereby causes affects changes in the market outcomes. One is going to be when the government imposes tax on the buyer, and the other one is when the government imposes tax on the producer. In addition to the effect of government taxations on either the buyer or the seller, we are also going to look at two other kinds of government intervention in the market. One of them is called a price floor, where the government imposes restrictions on the minimum price of a certain product. We will also talk about the idea of a government price ceiling, where the government imposes an upper limit on how much the price can be. We are going to conclude this discussion today by looking at an application of these price floor government policies, and our context is going to be the agricultural sector, where we are going to be talking about something called government price support, which is actually a combination of government price floor policy and also government subsidy policy, where the government combines these two policies and provide support to the agricultural production. We are going to be looking at each of these policy from the perspective of how it affects the allocation of resources for an economy. So mainly our question is going to be whether these kind of policy intervention makes market equilibrium outcomes or the market outcomes inefficient. Does it create any kind of inefficiency which without the government intervention would not be present? And we are going to I'm just going to give you the main conclusion of the entire discussion. We will see that anytime government intervenes, it is going to make the market allocation of resources inefficient because of various channels. But then government is a necessary evil, right? There are some certain cases where government is needed. But more on that later on. Today we are going to look at a very positive economics, quantitative approach towards understanding the role of government and how it affects market equilibrium outcomes. So we are going to start today with this definition, several definitions. First of all, our main in our first segment of today's lecture, we are going to look at the effect of taxes. When we analyze the effect of taxes, there are two concepts that we regularly talk about. One is this idea of tax incidence. Now, tax incidence is the division of the burden of a tax between the buyer and the seller. So, by using quantitative measurement and graphical tools, we will be able to say which tax is borne more by the buyer or the seller. Whenever there is a tax imposed, do the buyer pays the larger chunk of this tax, or do the seller bear the larger chunk of this tax? So tax incidence is a very important discussion. The other two discussions that we are going to be having concurrently is this idea of an excess burden of tax. So what we are going to show there, so let's look at the definition first. Excess burden of tax is excess burden in the form of deadweight loss, which means that whenever there is going to be some kind of tax, it is going to either lead to overproduction or underproduction, meaning that in the presence of a tax, the marginal benefit of the goods from the goods are not equal to the marginal cost. As a result, there is a mismatch between the condition that usually generates guarantees efficient allocation of resources. So what will happen is that excess burden really keeps track of the inefficiency created by tax policies, and most of those inefficiency are going to be in the form of deadweight loss. There is another additional interesting component of this effect of tax, burden of tax, in the form of government tax revenue. So you have to understand that whenever there is a tax imposed, either on the consumer or on the producer, part of the the tax revenue that either the consumer or the producer pays goes into the pocket of the government, and we should never think about that kind of tax as a loss from the economics perspective, because government most of the times collects those tax and uses it for various kind of benefit to the economy. But when in the context of this discussion today, we are going to talk about burden of tax, which is going to be the sum of government tax revenue and the deadweight loss. Out of the burden of tax, the excess burden of tax is just the deadweight loss. Okay, so let us start our discussion by looking at the effect of tax on the buyer. Now, our buyer usually pays taxes in the forms of a sales tax, and we are gonna let's first look at the basic dynamics of a tax and how it affects the tax, how it affects the market equilibrium outcomes. So when we look at the major effects of taxes, we are going to see that as a result of a tax, there will be a downward shift of the demand curve. So you should think about a tax like taking away part of your income, and we have learned from previous discussions that a decrease in income usually shifts the demand curve to the left. So that's very consistent with what we have learned before. It will lead to a reduction in the equilibrium quantity level. Then it will create a situation where consumers will end up paying a higher price. Unfortunately, it will also lead to a situation where the sellers end up receiving a lower price than what they otherwise would have received if there was no government tax. Now, this is interesting because what will happen is that we are going to see that as a result of this tax, part of the loss in consumer surplus, which really arises because our buyer ends up paying a higher price, and the part of loss of the producer surplus, which results from the fact that our sellers receive a lower amount of price and also probably sells less. This loss in consumer surplus and producer surplus is not lost entirely. Part of this loss of consumer surplus and producer surplus is being appropriated by the government in the form of tax revenue. But what will happen, and we're gonna show that, is that the government really cannot absorb all the loss of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So what happens is that at the end of the day, we will end up with a deadweight loss, which will be part of the loss of consumer surplus and part of the loss of producer surplus that is not appropriated by the government in the form of tax. Hence, we are going to have deadweight loss when the tax is imposed on the buyer. And that will be the excess burden of tax. So we will carry out this entire discussion today in the sort of graphical, by using graphical tools. So let me use some pre-drawn graphical tools first, and then I'll draw some more graphs. So let's look at this particular picture carefully. So we have a very classical market economy, market demand, market supply model. Imagine that there is no government imposition of tax. If there is no government imposition of tax, without government situation is represented by the blue supply curve and the blue demand curve. So when there was no government taxation, equilibrium with no tax would indicate that the equilibrium quantity would be 5 and the equilibrium price would be 10. Okay. Now imagine when the market is in equilibrium, notice that there are three components of the consumer surplus. One is it's actually the consumer surplus is actually this big big triangle which is below the market demand curve and above the market price. This really consists of a smaller triangle, then a rectangle, and then a larger triangle. Okay. Now so these are all consumer surplus. Now also at the same time, your producer surplus consists of three areas as well. Producer surplus is the area below the market price, above the market supply curve. So it includes now a rectangle, a smaller triangle, and a larger triangle. So that's my consumer surplus, and that's my producer surplus. Okay, so that's my so I'm not gonna draw anything at this point. Imagine now the government imposes a tax. Let's imagine that the tax is about $5. Okay, and I apologize, it's a $10 tax. Now when the tax is imposed on the buyer, this will be like taking $10 away from our consumer. What it will do, it will cause the demand curve to shift to the left, down, but equal to the amount of the tax. So the vertical distance between the original demand curve D, the blue one, and the new demand curve D, red one, minus tax, is 10. With the new demand curve and the original supply curve, we find equilibrium now at a point at which the equilibrium quantity is now 2 and the equilibrium price is minus 95. It's just 95, it's not minus 95, it's just 95. Okay, so notice what is happening. The government imposes a tax on the consumer, demand shifts to the left or down. As a result, equilibrium quantity goes down, and then equilibrium price also goes down. But we have to understand something very fundamental. At the new equilibrium, our producer receives $95, our consumer gives $95 to our producer because they are in equilibrium, and then our consumer pays another $10 to the government. So 95 is the price our producer receives, and 105 is the price our consumer pays, our buyer pays. 105 comes from $95 that they pay to the seller and $10 that they pay to the government. Okay, so let's now imagine the effect of this government policy. So first of all, we notice that as a result of this tax, production is going down, right? Because production before was 5, now it is 2, so it's going down. Then notice that at the new equilibrium quantity of 2, marginal benefit, which is indicated by how much the consumer is paying, is 105, is greater than the marginal cost, which is indicated by how much the producer is getting, which is 95. So at quantity 2, our marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost, which means that the economy wants more to be produced, but it is not happening. As a result, there is an underproduction. Now we have seen before that whenever there is underproduction, there is always deadweight loss. What we are going to do now, underproduction, what we are going to do now is we are going to try to understand the source of inefficiency now. Okay, so imagine that before our consumer was the consumer surplus was this larger triangle. Now as a result of the new price, so I'm going to delete that, otherwise it doesn't really, we cannot really see that. So before the triangle was the consumer surplus was the big triangle. Now the consumer surplus is the smaller triangle, this one. As a result, our consumer loses this rectangle as which is part of their consumer surplus, and they also lose this larger triangle part of their consumer surplus. So the loss of consumer surplus as a result of this underproduction is the rectangle, let's call it A, and the triangle, let's call it B. Producer's surplus now is also the smaller rectangle. That means our producer now loses the rectangle C and the triangle D, okay, as a result of this tax. Okay, now let's come back to the, so we can write it down. So loss of consumer surplus therefore is A plus B. Loss of producer surplus is C plus D. Then at the new equilibrium quantity of 2, the government receives a tax of $10 per unit. So government revenue is actually the rectangle, sum of the rectangle, part of which was consumer surplus loss from the consumer, and part of which is consumer surplus, producer surplus loss from the producer. So when we look at government revenue, the government revenue is nothing but A plus C. Okay, so now let's compare these numbers. Our consumer loses A plus B, our producer loses C plus D, then government gains A from consumer surplus loss and C from producer surplus loss. So what remains is this area B and D, which really does not get absorbed by the government revenue. So notice, so therefore we can say that B plus D is the dead weight loss of this tax, and B plus D is the excess burden of tax. Okay. Okay. Now let us summarize the effects. Whenever there is a tax imposed on the consumer, the demand curve shifts down. Our consumer pays a higher price than what our seller receives, because our consumer pays the tax, because the tax is imposed on the consumer. Our producer produces less because he receives less price. The price that our consumer pays is not the same as the price that our producer receives. So there is a mismatch between marginal benefit and marginal cost. As a result, economic outcomes are inefficient. There is a loss in consumer surplus and there is a loss in producer surplus, but part of those losses are accumulated by the government through taxations. They collect part of that loss in surplus as tax revenue, but even after collecting part of that as tax revenue, part of the loss in consumer surplus and producer surplus it becomes the loss of the economy, which basically is this larger triangle, and this is called the deadweight loss. Okay, now one critical question that we always ask to ourselves is that it is true that consumer surplus and producer surplus will be lost whenever there is a tax imposed on the buyer, but are these dimensions always the same? Or the more important question that we want to ask ourselves is that what determines the magnitude of these tax incidence? Are there conditions under which our buyer pays a larger share of the tax burden compared to our seller, and vice versa? And also, can we make some conclusions about, how the size of the deadweight loss can be minimized? So these are critical questions. We are going to first look at the effect of tax incidence and how it changes based on the kind of demand curve and supply curve we are looking at. Okay, we are going to be making three very important conclusions. Let me talk about the conclusions, and then I will draw graphs to show you that they make sense. Okay, so we are going to start with the statement by saying that the tax incidence really depends on depends on both the elasticity of the demand and the supply curve. And for a given elasticity of supply curve, the buyer pays a larger share of the tax the more inelastic the demand for the good is. Then for a given elasticity of demand curve, the seller pays a larger share of the tax the more inelastic the supply of the good is. So you can see that which side of the market pays the larger share of the tax burden really depends on how inelastic that side of the economy is. Statement number 3 is a little bit controversial. It says that excess burden is much smaller the more inelastic the demand or the supply curve is. Okay. Let me now go back to some white board where I would like to now take a moment to slowly draw some of these cases that we just talked about. First of all, I will look at a situation like the first one where we want to show the first case where we first want to explore the effect of elasticity of demand and how it affects the excess burden of tax. Okay, so what we are going to do, we are going to do two identical graphs. Okay, we're going to keep the supply curve, the shape of the supply curve the same. Okay. So we are going to keep the supply curve identical, and then in case A, and this is B, in case A I'm going to keep my demand curve fairly elastic, and in case B I'm going to keep my I'm going to make my demand more inelastic. Okay. Let's focus on A first. So at A, this is the original price and original quantity. P star and Q star is the original price and the original quantity that you would see in a marketplace. So this is my original demand curve. Now, as a result of a tax, let me just expand that a little bit so that we are going to assume that there is a leftward shift of the demand curve, and I'm going to keep that distance like this, and I'm gonna assume the exactly identical shift of the demand curve in both cases. So in case 1, our demand curve shifts from D to D1, and remember, A is our original market equilibrium. As a result of this downward shift, B is the new market equilibrium. So the new market equilibrium quantity is Q1, and the market equilibrium price that our producer receives is P1, but the price that our consumer pays is actually P2. So the gap between P1 and P2 basically is the price, is the tax that the government pays. So the gap between P1 and P2, so P2 minus P1 is the tax the government imposes. Okay, so again the same drill. The original market equilibrium was at A, the new market equilibrium is at point B, but at point B the quantity that consumer wants to buy is Q1 by paying P2, and the price that our producer receives is P1. So as a result of this tax, our consumer now loses let's say area M and N, and then our producer loses the rectangle O and rectangle P, rectangle O and triangle P. So in this case, deadweight loss is just N plus P. Okay, so that's the triangle that is the deadweight loss that we saw before. Okay, now again the same issue here. So this is my original demand curve, D is my original demand curve, and then D1 is my new demand curve. Under the same situation, the market equilibrium price was P star and Q star. As a result of this downward shift of the demand curve, we now have equilibrium like this, where let's delete the second graph because I think it is a little bit confusing now. I'm gonna delete that. I think in this case accuracy is kind of important, so that we understand. So I'm gonna draw it again. So that's my demand curve, and I'm gonna keep this supply curve the same. I'm gonna make these demand curves a little bit inelastic, so let's just think about it like that. And then this is the new original demand curve, D. I will be having the same kind of shift of the demand curve, so it's gonna be like that. And when you have, so original market price was price and output was P star and Q star. The new market equilibrium is Q1 and P1, but we just mentioned that at Q1 the price that consumer pays is P2, and the price that our producer receives is P1. If we again look at that calculation of deadweight loss, we'll see that the deadweight loss in this case is actually this triangle. So it will be a triangle like that. And if we compare the size of this triangle with the size of the previous triangle, we would see that the case with a more inelastic demand curve, so this one on the graph figure on the right, actually has a larger deadweight loss. So it is probably, so if you can play with the elasticity of the demand curve by making it even more elastic, and then you can show that the more inelastic the demand curve is, the larger is the size of the deadweight loss. And this is exactly what we wanted to find when we looked at the first argument, where you can just verify that for a given elasticity of the demand curve, the buyer pays a larger share of the tax, the more inelastic is the demand for that good. Okay. Let's redraw the graph one more time, because I think we also need to show you one more thing. So let's go over it one more time. So we have, okay, let's make this a little bit more concrete this time. So we have a demand curve, two demand curves, and then let's have the demand curve kind of like this. Okay. Let's have the demand curve like very flat, and then have the supply curve like this, and then this is the original market equilibrium price. This is original demand. Now demand shifts to the left, D1. We have a new equilibrium quantity Q1, a price P1 that the seller receives, and the price P2 that the consumer pays. Now I want to show you that the deadweight loss in this case is this triangle, and out of that the upper triangle is loss of consumer surplus, and the lower triangle is loss of producer surplus. Notice that in this particular case, the loss accrued to the consumer in the form of a loss of consumer surplus, the upper triangle, is very similar to the lower triangle, right? Meaning that in this case the loss of the consumer surplus and the loss of the producer surplus are very similar. The reason why this is the case is because the demand curve and the supply curve has very similar kind of elasticity. Things are going to look very different when we change the elasticity of our demand curve. So now let's keep the elasticity of our supply curve the same. It has the same shape, and now I'm going to make my demand curve a little bit more elastic, more inelastic. Okay, I'm gonna make it more inelastic like that. So now this was again do the labeling it the same way, P star, Q star, and then a vertical shift equivalent to the same amount, almost like this one. So this is D, this is D1. The new market equilibrium price is P2. The price that producer receives is P1, and then this is the loss of consumer surplus, and this is the loss of producer surplus. Okay. Now if you now want to compare between consumer surplus and producer surplus, loss of consumer surplus and producer surplus in case A versus case B, you would realize that compared to A, in case A, between A and B, our buyer and seller are losing almost similar amount. But when you compare these two rectangles, these two triangles, you should notice clearly that the upper triangle is larger than the lower triangle. Let me show you again. So if you think about it like that, it should be clear that the upper triangle is smaller than the lower triangle. Okay. And in that case, so the loss in consumer surplus by the consumer, which is the upper triangle, is larger than the loss of the producer surplus, which is the lower triangle. So what we have just done, from A to B, we have just made our demand more inelastic, and as a result our buyer seems to be bearing more of the excess burden of tax. Okay. Now this is consistent with what we saw in the first statement. Okay. Now let's look at the second one now. For a given elasticity of demand, the seller pays a larger share of the tax burden the more inelastic the supply of the good is. Okay. Now this is kind of a little bit tricky to do, so please stay with me. Okay. Because now what we're going to do is we are going to go back to our blackboard or whiteboard, and we are going to draw two market model case. This time, however, our demand curve will have the same elasticity in both cases. So let me just draw it right away so that we do not make any mistake this time. So we are gonna have like a demand curve like that. So we are gonna have a demand curve like that. I believe that they are parallel, so the similar elasticity. And then when there is a downward shift, I'm gonna assume, okay, so when they have like a downward shift of the tax as a result of this case, so we have two cases, A and B. In case A, demand shifts from D to D1. In first case, we are going to assume supply curve to be very elastic. So this is my supply curve, and in case number 2, we are going to assume my supply curve to be very inelastic, at least more inelastic than the for case 1. So this is S and S. So now let's go back to A. Q star, P star, my original price and quantity. Q1 and P1 is the price that our consumer pays. P2 is the price that the producer receives. A is the loss of consumer surplus. B is the loss of producer surplus. We should see immediate, so if this is A and this is B, we should see immediately that in case A, our consumer is bearing the larger share of the burden, right? Because the triangle is much larger. Let's now move to B, where the changes in the demand side is the same. We have the same market equilibrium price and quantity. We have a new quantity Q1, new price P1, and a new price that producer receives is P2. Okay, then this smaller upper triangle is loss of consumer surplus, and the lower triangle is the loss of producer surplus. It is now very important to look at these two graphs. In graph A, our loss of consumer surplus, the upper triangle was larger than lower triangle. So when supply was when supply less inelastic, our consumer was paying a larger share of the tax burden. In B, we see that the loss of consumer surplus, which is the upper triangle, is smaller than the loss of the producer surplus, the lower triangle. So in case when supply curve is inelastic or more inelastic, our producers bear the sellers or our producers bear a larger share of the tax burden. Okay, I hope this clarifies these things. This could sometimes be confusing. Let us now go back. I have provided some space in this lecture notes which I am going to upload in Blackboard so that you can have access to it. You can draw some of the graphs that I just drew and keep it for your record. Now what we're going to do, we're going to now move to the other side of the economy, where we are going to talk about how taxes affect the seller, and how sorry, I apologize, let me go back. So this time we're going to look at how a tax imposed on the seller affects the market equilibrium outcomes. We are going to look at some of these very straightforward ideas. So when a tax is imposed on the seller, this will be, for a seller, this will be like an increase in their cost of production, right? Because this will be, a seller has to really pay this tax for every unit of production they make. So this is literally an increase in their cost of production. We have learned before that whenever a cost of production increases, supply curve shifts to the left or shifts up. And that's exactly what is going to happen. Our supply curve is going to shift up upward by the amount of tax, then this will cause equilibrium quantities to go down. The prices paid by the consumer will go up, and unfortunately price received by the producer goes down. So there will be loss in consumer surplus and the loss in the producer surplus, just like we saw before. But in this case, part of the and similar to the previous case, the government is going to take part, sort of absorb part of the loss in consumer surplus and the part of the loss in producer surplus. But then there are part of consumer surplus and the producer surplus which will not be absorbed by the government. We will call it the deadweight loss, and that will be the excess burden of tax when the tax is imposed on the supplier. So let's look at this from a graphical perspective. Okay, so what you are seeing is a very traditional demand model where the original market equilibrium was at the intersection between the original demand and supply curve, and the original market equilibrium output was like 5. Now the government imposes a tax which causes supply curve to shift to the left. As a result, supply curve shifts from the blue one to the red one. We now have a new equilibrium where the equilibrium quantity is now 2 and the equilibrium price is 105. But you have to understand that this is the price that our consumer pays, and the price that our producer receives is actually just 95. Why? Because the producer takes 105 unit of price from the consumer and then pay the government $10 out of that price that they have received. So the government imposes a $10 tax, our consumer pays 105, our producer receives 95. Now you can see clearly that at this new equilibrium quantity of 2, marginal benefit is larger than marginal cost, which means that just like the previous case, we have an underproduction in this case. So the first thing that we are doing here is that we are having sort of like a underproduction in this case. So why do we have underproduction? So just to remind ourselves again, the original market equilibrium was at the situation where the new demand, the original demand and original supply curve intersected. Equilibrium price was 5, equilibrium quantity was 10. Now the government thinks about imposing a $10 tax on our producer. This is just like an increase in tax for our producer or seller. It causes a leftward shift of the supply curve by the exact amount of the tax the supplier pays. So the vertical distance between the new supply curve and the old supply curve is $10. At the new equilibrium, the equilibrium quantity is 2 and the equilibrium price is 105. So 105 is the price that consumer pays, but remember, the producer takes that 105 price, gives $10 to the government, and they actually receive only 95. Okay, so at the new equilibrium quantity of 2, the marginal benefit, which is 105, is greater than marginal cost, which is 95. So the economy wants to produce more, but the economy cannot produce more, so there is an underproduction. We have seen, just like in the previous case, anytime there is a underproduction, there is going to be deadweight loss. So just like the previous case, the loss of the consumer surplus is, so loss of consumer surplus is area rectangle A, then triangle B, the loss, so A plus B, the loss of consumer surplus, the loss of producer surplus is the rectangle C and the triangle D, but then the government appropriates part of this loss by collecting A from the consumer and C from the producer. So what we have is that there are two triangles that are really not appropriated by the government, which is B plus D. So B is the loss of consumer surplus as a result of this tax imposed on the producer, or seller, and D is the loss of producer surplus that originates from the producer because he is receiving a lower price. So B plus D is the deadweight loss of a tax that is imposed on the producer. Okay, let us now trying to understand how the magnitude of this deadweight loss and the magnitude of this excess burden is affected by the elasticity of supply and the demand curve. Okay, let's look at some of the cases that we're going to look at in a minute. First of all, let's look at A. For a given elasticity of supply, the buyer pays a larger share of the tax, the more inelastic the demand for the good is. Okay. Then number 2 says, for a given elasticity of demand, the seller pays a larger share of the tax, the more inelastic is the supply curve. The excess burden is smaller, the more inelastic demand or supply curve is. So this is almost a mirror image of what we just covered in the previous section, where we are seeing that the amount of tax burden really depends on the share of the tax burden really depends on the relative elasticity of the supply curve and the demand curve. For example, if the demand curve is more inelastic, the buyer pays a larger share of the tax burden. If the supply curve is more inelastic, the seller pays a larger share of the tax burden. And the excess burden or the deadweight loss size really depends on what kind of elasticity of demand we are looking at here. So let's look at them in more graphical manner. Imagine that, so let's look at the first one. So we have a situation where, let's look at the figure on the left. So we have a situation where the demand curve is vertical, meaning it's perfectly inelastic, and as a result of imposition of tax, our supply curve shifts up. Remember, our original equilibrium was at the intersection between the new demand and the old demand and the old supply curve. Market equilibrium quantity was 100, market equilibrium price was $2. When the supply curve shifts up, the market equilibrium quantity does not change, but the market equilibrium price increases to $2.20. So what is happening here? As the supply curve shifts up, our buyer pays $2.20. The seller takes that, produces the same quantity of 100 unit, and pay this extra 20 cents as tax to the government. So in this case, it should be clear that buyer bears the full amount of tax. The buyer bears tax burden because the seller effectively shifts the entire tax burden on the buyer. The buyer ends up paying the full amount of tax. But there is something also fundamental in this case. It is I think is fascinating, is that when you look at the marginal benefit and marginal cost, or a comparison between marginal benefit and marginal cost before and after the tax. Before the tax, the marginal benefit and the marginal cost were the same. After tax, the marginal benefit and the marginal cost is also the same. And since you are always on the demand curve, so in this case, although the buyer bears the full tax burden, there is no loss in consumer surplus or producer surplus. So in this case, when the demand curve is perfectly inelastic, a tax imposition is actually efficient. That's very, very interesting. And you can see that we actually have mentioned that in one of the statement. So perfectly inelastic demand curve, buyer pays the whole tax, and the market is efficient. Let's now move to the second graph in this picture. In the second one, what we have is a perfectly elastic demand curve. It's a vertical demand curve. Our original supply curve is the blue one. So at the original situation before the tax, the market equilibrium quantity was 4. The market equilibrium price was $1. when the supply curve shifts up, as a result of tax, equilibrium quantity goes down. Now that's a very important point. As a result of tax, we now see a reduction in production, which means that there is underproduction in this case. So at the new market equilibrium quantity, the price that our buyer pays is $1, but our producer takes that and pays the the tax, part of the tax from that price, and they actually end up receiving, I think there is a mistake there, but don't worry about it. They receive the remaining one. So what the point here is that in this case, if you compare the loss in consumer surplus, there is actually no loss in consumer surplus because our consumer is paying the same price, and the main loss in this case is the loss of the producer surplus. So this is the deadweight loss. This is because of the underproduction that is happening, and also because of the fact that our producer really does not receive the same price in both situations. Before, our producer was receiving $1. Now our producer has to pay back part of the tax that is imposed on them, so they end up getting a lower price. So in the second case, with a perfectly elastic demand curve, we have underproduction and we have producers receiving a price lower than what the consumer is paying. So I guess you can argue the fact that at the new production, marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost. So there is also no loss of efficiency. But the loss of efficiency is really not from the consumer side, but from the producer side. Hence, there is loss. But in this case, the price is the tax is actually paid by the producer. So let's look at it one more time. So in both cases, our consumer is paying the same price. Before tax, they were paying $1. After tax, they also pays $1. But since the supply curve shifts to the left and our demand curve is horizontal, our supplier ends up paying the tax, which is the difference between the price that they received before and the price that they receive now. So in this case, our producer pays the whole tax and our market is inefficient. Okay. Okay. We can look at two more cases, and these are also interesting ones. The next one is a situation where the supply curve is perfectly inelastic. So this is this one, the graph on the left. So when the supply curve is perfectly elastic, you have before tax. Let's imagine that the quantity was 100, the price was 45. Since as a result of tax, as a result of the vertical supply curve, the supply curve really cannot go up or go down. It cannot shift. But what the supplier can do, they can say that now we are going to charge you a larger price or a higher price, which is $50, and there's no change in the production. But if you compare the price that our producer receives, there is a change, right? So before the producer was getting $50 as price, but after that, whenever there is a tax imposed, they receive that same $50 tax and produce that same $100 units, but now they can get only $45 in their pocket because they have to pay a tax to the government. So in this case, again, this is interesting because the seller is paying the full amount of tax, but notice that there is no divergence between the marginal cost and marginal benefit. There is no change in production, so production is the same, which means that this tax really does not affect the production. It doesn't have any effect on the consumer surplus or the producer surplus. Hence, surprisingly, for an inelastic supply curve, the market is actually efficient. This tax is efficient. So that's like our point number 6. The last one is when we have perfectly elastic supply curve. So now we are looking at the right graph. Original equilibrium was at the intersection between the perfectly elastic supply curve and regular demand curve. Equilibrium quantity was 5, equilibrium price was 10. Now as a result of tax, our supply curve can take a upward shift, and the shift is equal to the amount of tax. So as a result of unchanged demand curve and an upward shift of the supply curve, we have an equilibrium at the intersection between the new supply curve, red one, the blue supply, the original demand curve, the blue one. The new equilibrium quantity is 3, the new equilibrium price is 11. So first of all, there is underproduction in this case, and also the price the consumer now pays is $11. But the price that our producer receives is 10, because our producer has to pay part of the tax. So at the new equilibrium quantity 3, notice that marginal benefit, which is 11, is higher than marginal cost, which means that there is a loss from the producer economics perspective. The economy wants more production, but there is underproduction. So when there is underproduction, there obviously has to be some kind of deadweight loss. So the deadweight loss is indicated by the shaded rectangle, triangle. Our buyer is paying the full tax, right? Because as a result of this tax, the only thing is that our buyer ends up paying a higher price of $11. So our buyer pays the whole tax, and obviously there is a deadweight loss. Deadweight loss makes this outcome inefficient. So depending on different kinds of elasticity of the demand and supply curve, the market outcomes can be efficient or inefficient, but more importantly, the share of the burden of tax could be fundamentally different. So that's an interesting concept. Okay, so the next one that we're going to look at is called a price ceiling. What is a price ceiling? A price ceiling is a government regulation that places an upper limit on the price that can prevail in an economy. Okay, the example of a price ceiling is a rent ceiling, where the government makes an announcement that a price of apartment in certain area cannot fall below a certain level. So obviously we want to understand how this kind of price ceiling affects the market outcomes. And we are going to do it by using the graph that we are using here. So let's go through this graph slowly. So what we have here is a classic example of a price ceiling. So imagine the original demand curve is the blue line, the original supply curve is the blue line. So this is supply curve, this is demand curve. Without any price ceiling, your equilibrium would have been at quantity 4, and the equilibrium price, let's say, would have been 600. Okay, so that would have been the market equilibrium. So this would be my P star, and this would be my Q star. Now the government imposes a rent ceiling, which means that government says that prices cannot be anything above 400, meaning that regardless of how many apartments are being rented, regardless of how many people are willing to rent an apartment, how many people are willing to supply rent apartment, rents cannot rise above 400. Notice 400 is a rent level which is below the market equilibrium rent of 600. Which means that government is literally putting a ceiling on how much rent can be. So what is going to happen at this rent ceiling? At $400 rent, the amount of at this $400 amount of rent, the amount of apartments that people want to rent is 6. Because the rent has been made cheaper. The amount of rent that producers want to supply is 3. So please remember this. The amount of rent apartment that buyers want to buy is 6. The amount of rent that producers want to sell or rent is 3. So there is a mismatch. There is a major mismatch. Okay, so what is happening here? The market equilibrium price in an unrestricted market would have been 600, and 4,000 or some kind of units, 4 units of houses would have been sold. But now government puts a rent ceiling, which causes the market to really be affected in various ways. First of all, the price that the consumer or the buyer pays and the price that the sellers receive go down from 600 to 400. And also, since our producers are now receiving a lower price, they are going to be less willing to rent apartments at the ongoing price. So there is going to be excess demand, which is indicated by the difference between 6 and 3. There is going to be an excess demand for houses. So what happens when there is excess demand for houses? First thing, people have to search for houses more frequently, more intensively, and that requires resources. But what is more important and more severe is that when there are too many people looking for houses, then houses being available, it can sort of create a underground or illegal market where the landlord will do under the table dealings with tenants, saying that the only way you can get more apartments from me is if you pay me a higher rent than what the government is mandating. So we can see that from a more theoretical perspective as follows. So imagine that at the quantity that is being rented by the renting companies, which is 3, the marginal benefit of those 3 units is 625, which is how you go to the demand curve and find, and the marginal cost is 400. So this difference between marginal benefit and marginal cost asks for a situation where more houses should be rented because there is underproduction, but it is not working out. So the underproduction as a result of this rent ceiling is indicated by this triangle again, and this is obviously deadweight loss. But in the previous case, part of the loss of consumer surplus and producer surplus, which actually is this rectangle in the used to be appropriated by the government because government was collecting a tax. Here, the government is not collecting tax. The government is imposing a price ceiling, which ends up causing people to search for houses more, and then there is this illegal market that sets up, which can really jack up the price. We can say that the cost of all these market inefficiencies can be summarized by this rectangle, which we will call the resources lost as a result of this price ceiling. So in this case, the tax burden, we should not call it tax burden, we should just call it burden of tax price ceiling, is going to be the rectangle plus the triangle. Okay. Now, why are these happening? This burden is being imposed on the economy because the government imposed a ceiling on the price, which really prevented from the market reaching an equilibrium, right? So notice that as a result of the price ceiling, the economy can never go to their desired market equilibrium of 600. This is the reason behind the price ceiling having a negative impact on the market, in the sense that the price ceiling is imposed on the market where the price ceiling is below the market equilibrium. Imagine for 1 minute that the price ceiling was imposed on a place such as let's say around 700. Would that have any effect? So the government says that the price ceiling is 700. Will that have the same kind of effects that we just discussed? The answer is no. Why? Because even if the government imposes a price ceiling of 700, notice that the economy never reaches that 700 level of price, which means if the economy's price ceiling is set at 700, the equilibrium price would be 600, the equilibrium quantity would be 4, and that would be the end of the story. So this, when the price is set above the market equilibrium price, like 700 in this case, it has no effect on the market. It has no effect on the market. Okay, so let us now summarize what is going to happen when there is a price ceiling. When there is a price ceiling, we are going to say that there would be a shortage to begin with. And whenever there is a shortage, it is going to lead to two undesirable property on the market. One is that there is going to be a black market. Second is that there is going to be increased search activity, which will force people to use additional resources. Now, resources would be lost because people would be forced to pay a higher price than they would otherwise be willing to pay, and also because of the search activities. So we have just seen that as a result of this high price, underproduction, and intense search, there would be a deadweight loss. So a price ceiling set above the market, below the market equilibrium price, creates deadweight loss on the economy. But what is very interesting is that if the price ceiling is set above the market equilibrium level, none of the above effects would occur. Therefore, the conclusion that we are going to make is that when the price ceiling is set below the market equilibrium, it will lead to inefficient outcomes for our economy. Okay. The next one is a discussion about price floor. So what is a price floor? Let's look at the definition. A price floor is a government regulation that places a lower limit on the price at which a particular goods, services, or resources can be traded. Okay. So a price ceiling is opposite to a price floor. A price ceiling is opposite to a price floor in the sense that in case of a price ceiling, you set the maximum cap on the price. In case of a price floor, you set the minimum cap on the price. The classic example of price floor is minimum wage, where the government says that in an economy, wages, which is the price of your work, can never fall below a certain level. Please remember that this kind of price floor argument is very serious because price floor makes it illegal to pay a price for a good lower than that price floor. Let us now try to understand the effect of price floor in the context of a market with a minimum wage law. Okay, so again, imagine that the original market equilibrium, market demand and market supply was the blue one. So we had a market equilibrium happening at where the price is like 5 and the quantity is like 5, and the government then imposes a minimum wage of $7. Having a minimum wage of $7 is kind of important because it is set above the market equilibrium, which means that the government is forcing the producers to pay this $7 per hour of wage. And since the producers cannot really ignore this rule, what they are going to do is that they are going to demand less workers. So they are going to hire 3 workers. Please remember, this is a labor market, so the demand curve is where the suppliers are, right, or the producers are, and supply is where the consumer surplus is, the workers are, right. So this is where the workers are. Okay, so when that happens, our producers or suppliers demand less worker, and our consumers or households are willing to supply more work, and that's a problem because at the new price of $7, minimum price of $7, we now have something called an excess supply. Okay, or sometimes it is called a surplus. Simple. When you have surplus of worker, this is obviously a problem, right? So let's imagine, so what is happening is that several things are going to happen. So if there is an excess supply of worker, our workers are going to again look more intensively for jobs, but that's not the most important or serious problem. The problem is that our producers will now be in an ideal situation where they are going to have an under the table deal with the workers. They will tell the workers that, look, I'm not going to pay you $7. You can either remain unemployed, or you can work for me, and I will pay you something less than the $7. So this will be an under the table deal. So although officially firms will fire workers because they are simply not willing to hire 5 workers anymore, which was the equilibrium. Now they are willing to hire only 3, so there is going to be unemployment. This will be official unemployment. On the unofficial side, producers might actually continue to hire more workers by paying them a lower wage. Regardless of what that happens, we know that if there is this unemployment, official unemployment, it means that some of the resources of the economy are unutilized, which is basically indicated by this triangle, which is the deadweight loss. Also, there is going to be loss from the economy side, in the sense that the consumers are going to, the workers are going to spend a lot of time looking for jobs, and our producers are going to exploit them by offering them a lower job, by offering them a lower wage. That these inefficiencies are being indicated by this pink rectangle. So the effect of a minimum wage, which is an example of a price floor that is set above the market equilibrium, is that it is going to create deadweight loss, and also resources of the economy will be lost. So the effect of a price floor is serious when it is set above the market equilibrium level. Let us summarize this. In case of a price floor such as the minimum wage, we have found that it increases search activities. It leads to illegal hiring under the table, where the employer offers a lower wage, but it raises the official unemployment rate. So whenever official unemployment rate increases, it means that some of the resources of the economy are not utilized properly. As a result, there is deadweight loss. So if the price floor such as the minimum wage law is set above the market equilibrium wage, above the market equilibrium wage, it is going to cause all these negative effects. But notice what would have happened if we have set that minimum wage law at a level below the market equilibrium wage. Let's say the minimum wage is set at $4 per hour. Okay, so here let's say this is minimum wage. So if minimum wage rate was set, let's say, at a level less than market equilibrium wage, let's say $4, notice that it has no effect on the economy, because although there is a minimum wage of $4, our producers are willing to pay $5 and hire 5 workers, right? So they are willing to offer a higher wage than what the minimum wage wants them to pay. So as a result, what will happen, that this minimum wage set below the market equilibrium has no effect on the market efficiency or inefficiency. So this is a very, very powerful point, where we are going to make the final conclusion by saying that a price floor set above the market equilibrium wage is inefficient. A price floor set below the market equilibrium wage has no effect on the market. Let us now move to the last part of this chapter, this discussion, which is a discussion about price support, right? Price support is very commonly used by almost all the government of the world, especially government where agricultural production is the predominant source of income for the economy. The government price support is a combination of various policies. One of them is a price floor. The other one is what we call a subsidy. And the government usually combines these two ideas to get to deliver these price support policies for the market. So let's look at some definitions first. First of all, the definition of price support is actually a price floor in the context of agricultural market, and where what the government does is that they support the price floor by providing the sort of making a promise that they will always buy back the surplus production by the farmers. Okay, the government usually backs that up by maintaining a price floor above the market equilibrium price, so that at this high price, if the producers are unable to sell all of their product, the government will buy back the surplus product they have. So basically, price support is a combination of a price floor control by the government, and it also includes the promise of the government when they buy back the surplus production, which is similar to what we call a subsidy. So let's look at the subsidy definition. A subsidy is a payment by the government to producers to cover part of the cost of production, right? The example that we're going to look at, government really does not directly pay our agricultural producers for their cost of production. What the government does is that government promises that it will buy back the surplus production the farmer produces, and essentially it is similar to farms getting like a free money from the government, right? Because both of them, a subsidy in the purest form where government really pays for the cost of production, and the kind of subsidy that we're looking at here where the government buys back part of the unsold production, both affects the profit margin of the firms in the same way, something that we're going to look at later. Let us now look at the effect of agricultural price support in a graphical context. Again, the same argument is, we are going to start with the same argument. The original equilibrium is where the demand and supply intersects each other. So we are looking at a competitive equilibrium where competitive equilibrium price is 25, competitive equilibrium quantity is 25. So that's where everything stands. Now suddenly the government decides that they are going to provide an agricultural price support. By providing that, government increases the price floor from 25 to 35. So remember, this is a price floor which is set above the market equilibrium price level, and it has a serious effect on the market. When the market price goes from 25 to 35, notice that the amount that consumers want to buy is 20, the amount that producers want to sell is 30. So there is now an excess surplus. There is a surplus of production in this economy. The producers simply cannot sell everything that they want to sell. There are two sides. There are two parts that we are going to first look at. First of all, notice that at the amount that are being produced in the economy, this is first of all overproduction, because the society really does not need this amount. At this overproduction, the marginal benefit, which is here, is lower than marginal cost. Marginal benefit is smaller than marginal cost, which basically says that there is overproduction, production needs to go down, but farms don't listen to that because they know the government is buying back their surplus production. So there is overproduction, and government really buys back the surplus, which is the 10 units of production that is unsold, between 20 what the consumer is buying and between 30 what the producer is selling. So government therefore buys this 10 units of output by paying 35 unit price for each of them, right? So the government basically therefore provides a subsidy which is equal to the rectangle, the pink rectangle that also includes the deadweight loss. So this is a very serious problem where, as a result of price support, the loss, economic loss, is the rectangle plus the triangle. There are two losses, and both of them tell us that economic outcomes are inefficient. Okay, so let us summarize what we have just covered. When we have an agricultural price support set above the market equilibrium wage, set above the market equilibrium, we are going to have that this is going to increase the revenue of the firm. There is going to be a loss of government revenue because of the subsidy, because government has to pay for that. there is going to be overproduction, there is going to be underconsumption, and there is going to be deadweight loss. If this price support was set below the market equilibrium price, none of this would have happened, right? Just like we saw that the level of these supports, control or floor really depends, affects the market outcomes. So in this case, if the price floor in the form of an agricultural subsidy is set above the market equilibrium price, this policy is going to be inefficient. On the other hand, if the price floor is set below the market equilibrium price level, it is going to have no effect on the market. Okay, so I hope that this sort of summarizes the basic points that I wanted to cover regarding how government intervention affects the market. We looked at the effect of government policy, tax policies on the consumer and the producer. We looked at price floor, price control, and then we concluded this chapter with an application of price floor in the agricultural context when we looked at this idea of government price support policy. So thank you very much. Have a nice day.